Hi.
They say curiosity kills the cat, but sometimes it can also destroy a life as you know it. The mail arrived on a bright Wednesday morning, a little cardboard box stamped with a logo promising insights into one's ancestry and genetics. My wife, Emily, had suggested the test as a fun way to learn more about our backgrounds. She loved digging into history and family lore, so the idea of uncovering hidden roots and long-lost relatives appealed to her. I had agreed, though mostly out of her enthusiasm. Little did I know, that decision would ignite a chain reaction that would upend my world. We spit into the little tubes, sealed them, and sent them off. The entire process felt clinical and mundane, and I quickly forgot about it. A few weeks later, an email arrived. The results were ready. Emily and I sat side by side at the computer, clicking through the ancestry data, marveling at the percentage breakdowns and colorful maps tracing our genetic footprints. She was thrilled to find traces of Irish ancestry, which she'd long suspected. I learned that my paternal lineage was more Scandinavian than I had thought. It was all lighthearted and amusing until we reached the final section. Shared DNA matches. Emily's name appeared at the top of my list as expected, marked as my spouse. But then there was Jack, our 6-year-old son. Or rather, there wasn't. His name didn't appear at all. I felt a cold wave wash over me as I double-checked, triple-checked, searching for a glitch or an error. But the data was clear. My son, the boy I had raised, taught to ride a bike, and tucked in every night, was not biologically mine. Emily's hand on the mouse froze. The playful excitement on her face was replaced by a pallor that made her look almost ghostly. She clicked through the data again, but the result didn't change. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. I told myself there must have been a mistake in the testing process. Maybe the samples got mixed up. Maybe the lab had made an error. But deep down, in the part of me that knew her better than anyone, I saw the truth in her eyes. Jack wasn't my son. The days that followed felt like walking through a haze. My once stable world was suddenly riddled with cracks, each one threatening to shatter the life I had built with Emily. I couldn't look at Jack the same way. Not because of him, he was still the sweet, curious, and mischievous boy I adored. But every glance brought an ache, a reminder of the betrayal lurking in the shadows of our marriage. Emily became withdrawn, her usual vivacity replaced by a quiet nervousness. She didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't press her immediately. The weight of the revelation was too much to confront head-on. Instead, I found myself going through the motions. Work, school drop-offs, meals eaten in silence. But in the quiet hours of the night, as she lay asleep beside me, my mind churned with questions. When had it happened? Who was he? Did Emily know all along? Every possibility seemed worse than the last. I wanted to demand answers, to lash out, to confront her, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of knowing the full truth or the fragile hope that there was some explanation, however improbable, that would make sense of this nightmare. The truth, however, has a way of demanding to be known. Driven by the need for clarity, I began piecing together the fragments of our past. Emily and I had met in college, our connection immediate and electric. She was studying art history, and I was deep into my engineering program. Despite our differences, we clicked in ways that seemed effortless. We married young, surrounded by friends and family who celebrated our whirlwind romance. Jack was born 3 years later, a joyful addition to a life that had felt nothing short of perfect. As I sifted through memories, I began to notice details that once seemed trivial but now carried a darker weight. There was the sudden friendship she had struck up with a colleague at her old job, a charismatic writer named Ryan. I'd met him a handful of times at work functions, always finding him overly charming in a way that made me vaguely uncomfortable. Emily had brushed off my concerns back then, laughing and calling me paranoid. Looking back, I wondered if that was the beginning. With growing unease, I began looking for concrete answers. I searched through old photos, emails, and messages, hoping to uncover a clue that would either confirm or dispel my suspicions. What I found were traces. A casual dinner meeting she hadn't mentioned, a few playful exchanges that bordered on flirtation. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to fuel my growing doubt. Finally, unable to bear the weight of silence, I confronted Emily one night. Her reaction was a mix of denial and deflection, her eyes darting nervously as I laid out my suspicions. But her silence on the key question, whether she had been unfaithful, spoke louder than words. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. The ambiguity was maddening, a limbo that offered no resolution. As days turned into weeks, I realized I couldn't rely on Emily to provide the answers I needed. If she couldn't or wouldn't tell me the truth, I would find it myself. My first step was to revisit the DNA testing site, this time with a more focused intent. I explored the data in greater depth, combing through potential matches to Jack's DNA profile. If I couldn't identify the father outright, I could at least narrow down the possibilities. To my surprise, a name did appear. It wasn't Ryan, the colleague I had suspected. It was someone else entirely. A man named Daniel, whose profile indicated a close familial relationship to Jack. I didn't recognize the name, but the discovery sent a chill down my spine. It meant Jack's biological father was out there, and now I had a thread to follow. I began digging into Daniel's information, using social media and public records to piece together his identity. What I found was unsettling. Daniel was older than Emily by several years, a successful entrepreneur who lived in a nearby city. His online presence was polished and curated, filled with photos of lavish vacations, charity events, and a seemingly perfect family life. But beneath the surface, there were inconsistencies, whispers of a man with a penchant for extramarital affairs. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily's betrayal wasn't just a personal failure. It was entangled with a man who had likely done this before. My anger deepened, but so did my resolve. This was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about confronting it head-on, no matter where it led. The discovery of Daniel's name changed everything. It was no longer an abstract suspicion or a vague unease. There was now a tangible link to the truth, a man with a name, a face, and a connection to the child I had raised as my own. The weight of it bore down on me like a physical presence, each breath coming harder than the last. I couldn't stop imagining how Emily's betrayal intertwined with Daniel's existence, nor could I shake the looming question. How deep did the lies go? I decided I needed more before confronting Emily. Anger surged within me, but anger alone wouldn't unearth the truth. I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened, to have answers ready for the questions that clawed at my mind during sleepless nights. Daniel's social media was a curated facade, carefully designed to project success and stability. Photos of smiling family gatherings, business achievements, and picturesque vacations painted a portrait of a man who seemingly had it all. But as I delved deeper, cracks in the image began to emerge. Comment threads hinted at strained relationships, and occasional posts carried cryptic captions that spoke of regrets and second chances. It was subtle, but enough to suggest that the man behind the veneer wasn't as perfect as he appeared. What struck me most were the timelines. I cross-referenced the dates of his travels and significant events with my own life. To my dismay, there were overlaps. Moments when Emily's inexplicable absences or sudden work commitments aligned suspiciously with Daniel's trips to our city. These were not coincidences. Each connection felt like another brick in a wall being built between me and the life I thought I knew. I also uncovered records that suggested Daniel had frequented a particular hotel, the same one Emily had once mentioned during an offhand comment about a company retreat. The pattern was undeniable. Still, I hesitated to act. Despite the mounting evidence, part of me clung to the hope that there was an explanation, however implausible, that would make sense of it all. It was a cold Friday evening when I finally decided to confront Emily. Jack was staying over at a friend's house for the night, giving us the privacy we needed for what I knew would be an explosive conversation. Emily had just returned from work, her usual cheer subdued in recent weeks. The tension between us had grown palpable, each interaction laced with unspoken accusations and quiet evasions. I began by showing her the DNA results again, laying them on the table like an indictment. Her face drained of color as her eyes darted from the document to mine. Before she could speak, I placed a printed photo of Daniel in front of her, alongside the records I had compiled. Her reaction was a mix of shock and resignation. For a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with, the one who had shared my dreams and built a life with me. But that fleeting image was replaced by someone I barely recognized. A woman caught in the web of her own making, struggling to find an escape. Emily admitted to knowing Daniel but stopped short of confessing to an affair. She spoke of him as a colleague, someone she had once worked closely with on a major project. Her tone was measured, almost rehearsed, as she described their interactions as professional and fleeting. But her words didn't align with the evidence I had gathered. The photos, the overlapping timelines, the lingering looks in the few pictures they had together, they told a different story. When I pressed her, she became defensive, accusing me of invading her privacy and jumping to conclusions. But her anger couldn't mask the cracks in her facade. She avoided my gaze, her hands fidgeting nervously as she spoke. Each deflection felt like confirmation of the truth I already knew but didn't want to accept. The conversation ended in a stalemate. Emily retreated to the bedroom, leaving me alone with the evidence and the crushing weight of unanswered questions. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling as my mind replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I might have missed. The warmth and intimacy we once shared now felt like a cruel illusion, replaced by a cold, unyielding reality. In the days that followed, our interactions became increasingly strained. Emily avoided me, her guilt manifesting as silence and avoidance. I focused on Jack, pouring my energy into being the father he deserved. He remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had engulfed our lives, his laughter and innocence a stark contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface. But even as I tried to shield Jack from the fallout, I couldn't escape the need for closure. I needed to confront Daniel, to hear his side of the story and understand the extent of his involvement. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Jack and the truth he would one day deserve to know. Contacting Daniel was easier than I expected. A carefully worded message through a professional networking site elicited a prompt response. He agreed to meet, his tone cordial but cautious. I chose a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, to ensure the conversation remained civil. When Daniel walked in, I was struck by his composure. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being in control. His tailored suit and polished demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos he had unwittingly brought into my life. As we sat across from each other, I couldn't help but feel a surge of resentment. Here was the man who had disrupted my family, yet he appeared unaffected, his expression calm and unreadable. I began by laying out the facts, careful to keep my emotions in check. Daniel listened intently, his face betraying little. When I mentioned Jack, however, a flicker of something crossed his features. Recognition, perhaps, or guilt. He didn't deny knowing Emily, nor did he refute the possibility that Jack might be his son. But his responses were carefully measured, offering little in the way of concrete answers. What struck me most was his detachment. He spoke of his relationship with Emily in vague terms, describing it as a mistake born of poor judgment. He expressed regret but stopped short of taking full responsibility, his words carefully chosen to absolve himself of blame. It was clear he had no intention of disrupting his own life to address the consequences of his actions. As I left the meeting, I felt a mix of anger and despair. Daniel's unwillingness to engage left me with more questions than answers. But it also solidified my resolve. If he and Emily wouldn't provide the truth, I would find it myself. For Jack's sake, and for my own, I couldn't let this remain unresolved. The meeting with Daniel had left me disoriented, as though I had been cast adrift in an unfamiliar sea. His calculated words, his careful avoidance of responsibility, and the vague acknowledgement of his connection to Emily and Jack gnawed at me. He had managed to say so little while revealing so much. Yet, his detachment solidified my resolve to dig deeper, not just for my sake but for Jack's. I began retracing the threads of Emily's life with a determination that bordered on obsession. Every unexplained absence, every cryptic comment, every interaction with people I had barely noticed at the time now took on new significance. I wasn't just trying to confirm her betrayal, I was trying to understand the scope of it. Somewhere in that understanding, I hoped to find a way to reclaim some semblance of control over the chaos that had engulfed my life. The overlapping timelines between Daniel's travels and Emily's absences became my starting point. I cross-referenced her work calendar, painstakingly reconstructed from emails and old planner entries, with the public records and social media posts I had gathered from Daniel's life. What emerged was a map of deceit. There were multiple trips that Emily had labeled as business conferences or client meetings, all aligning with Daniel's known locations at the time. One particular entry stood out: a weekend trip to a nearby city where Emily had claimed to be attending a training seminar. Daniel had posted photos from the same city that weekend, including a shot of a distinctive restaurant that Emily had mentioned in passing when she returned. I could picture them there together, laughing, sharing a meal, their duplicity masked by the mundanity of everyday life. The image burned in my mind, fueling my anger but also my determination. Emily's behavior in the weeks following the DNA revelation had become increasingly erratic. She oscillated between attempts to feign normalcy and periods of withdrawal so intense that she seemed almost like a stranger. Her silence was its own confession, each unspoken word reinforcing the distance between us. Yet, she still clung to the remnants of our life, as though refusing to let go would somehow erase the truth. It was during one of her more desperate attempts to salvage our relationship that I found the missing pieces of the puzzle. Emily had gone out to run errands, leaving her laptop open on the kitchen counter. My resolve wavered for only a moment before I began searching through her files. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the need for answers. The folder labeled personal contained a series of emails and messages that confirmed what I already suspected. Emily and Daniel's relationship had begun nearly 7 years ago, not long after Jack's birth. The messages ranged from casual banter to intimate confessions, chronicling an affair that had persisted through the years. Some were mundane, discussions about schedules, inside jokes, but others were searingly intimate, the kind of words that left no room for misinterpretation. What struck me most was the tone of their correspondence. It wasn't just physical. There was an emotional depth to their exchanges that felt like a knife to the heart. Emily had confided in him in ways she no longer did with me, sharing fears, dreams, and vulnerabilities. Reading their messages was like witnessing the dismantling of my own marriage, piece by agonizing piece. With this new evidence in hand, I confronted Emily once more. This time, there was no room for her to deflect or deny. I presented the timeline, the emails, the photos, a damning collection that laid bare the reality of her betrayal. Her reaction was a mix of shock and resignation, her tears flowing freely as she finally confessed to the affair. Emily's story spilled out in fragments, each piece more devastating than the last. She admitted to meeting Daniel through a work event and feeling an instant connection. Their affair had begun as a fleeting indiscretion but had evolved into something deeper over time. She spoke of feeling trapped in our marriage, of struggling to reconcile the life we had built with the person she believed herself to be. She insisted that she had tried to end things with Daniel multiple times but had always found herself drawn back to him. It was both an explanation and an indictment, a plea for understanding that only deepened the chasm between us. Her words painted a picture of a woman torn between two lives, but they did little to soothe the ache of betrayal. I listened in silence, my emotions too raw to articulate. When she finished, I simply walked away, leaving her to grapple with the weight of her choices. As I tried to process the truth, my thoughts kept returning to Jack. He was innocent in all of this, unaware of the turmoil that had upended our lives. Yet, his place in the narrative was inescapable. He was the product of Emily's betrayal, a living reminder of the lies that had infiltrated our marriage. But he was also my son in every way that mattered. I had been there for his first steps, his first words, his first scraped knee. Biology be damned, he was mine. I resolved to protect Jack from the fallout as much as possible. He didn't need to know the details, not yet. But I couldn't ignore the implications of Daniel's presence. If Jack was his biological child, then Daniel's involvement or lack thereof would inevitably shape his future. The thought filled me with a sense of dread, but also determination. I needed to confront Daniel once more, this time with Jack's well-being at the forefront of the conversation. Reaching out to Daniel was not an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. I arranged another meeting, this time in a more neutral setting. When we met, I laid out the situation plainly. Jack's parentage was no longer in question, and Daniel's role in his life needed to be addressed. My focus was on Jack, not the animosity I felt toward Daniel or the resentment that lingered between us. To my surprise, Daniel's reaction was one of genuine concern. He admitted to feeling conflicted about his role as Jack's biological father, expressing regret for the choices that had led to this moment. Yet, his words carried the same detachment I had noticed before, a reluctance to fully engage with the consequences of his actions. He agreed to discuss potential arrangements but stopped short of making any concrete commitments. As I left the meeting, I felt a mix of frustration and relief. Daniel's involvement, however tentative, was a step forward. But it was clear that the path ahead would be anything but straightforward. The tangled web of relationships and emotions surrounding Jack's identity would take time and effort to unravel. In the weeks that followed, I focused on building a new sense of normalcy for Jack and myself. Emily moved out temporarily, giving us the space we needed to heal. Our interactions remained strained, but there were moments of clarity and honesty that hinted at the possibility of co-parenting amicably. Daniel's involvement remained minimal, his promises of engagement often overshadowed by his reluctance to disrupt his own life. Through it all, Jack remained my anchor. His laughter, his curiosity, and his boundless energy reminded me of what truly mattered. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would do whatever it took to protect him and ensure his happiness. As weeks turned into months, the dust from the initial revelation began to settle, but the fractures in my life remained glaring. Emily had moved out temporarily, giving us the space we both needed to process. Jack, blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding him, continued to be my constant, his innocence a balm to the chaos. But even as I tried to find a new rhythm, the complexities of the situation refused to untangle themselves. Instead, they grew more knotted, revealing unexpected truths and forcing me to confront choices I never thought I'd have to make. Emily's absence brought its own set of challenges. She reached out often, her messages and calls carrying a tone of regret and desperation. She wanted to repair what had been broken, to find a way back to the life we had shared. But every interaction reminded me of the betrayal, of the trust that had been shattered. Her efforts to explain, to justify, her actions often felt hollow, as though she was trying to convince herself as much as me. What struck me most was her insistence on her love for Jack and me. She painted herself as a woman torn between conflicting desires, caught in a moment of weakness that spiraled beyond her control. While part of me wanted to believe her, another part couldn't ignore the depth of her deception. Love, after all, was not just about feelings, it was about choices, and Emily had made choices that spoke volumes. Despite my anger, I couldn't ignore her pain. She was struggling, not just with the consequences of her actions but with the loss of the life we had built. It was in those moments of vulnerability that I glimpsed the woman I had fallen in love with, the partner who had once shared my dreams. But those glimpses were fleeting, overshadowed by the weight of her choices and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Daniel's role in the unfolding drama continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Initially, his involvement had been minimal, his promises of engagement often overshadowed by his reluctance to disrupt his own life. But as time passed, he began to show more interest in Jack. Whether out of genuine concern or guilt, he initiated conversations about his potential role as Jack's biological father. These discussions were fraught with tension. Daniel's approach was calculated, his words carefully chosen to avoid commitment, while still expressing a willingness to do what's right. I couldn't shake the feeling that his motivations were as much about preserving his image as they were about Jack's well-being. Still, his increasing involvement forced me to confront a difficult reality. Jack's identity was no longer solely tied to me. Daniel proposed a gradual introduction, a series of meetings where he could get to know Jack without overwhelming him. I reluctantly agreed, setting clear boundaries to ensure that Jack's comfort and happiness remained the priority. Those first meetings were awkward and stilted, Daniel's attempts at connection falling flat against Jack's natural wariness. Yet, as the weeks went on, a tentative bond began to form. Jack, ever curious and open-hearted, seemed to accept Daniel with a simplicity that left me both relieved and heartbroken. While navigating the delicate dynamics between Jack, Daniel, and myself, I continued to grapple with the lingering questions surrounding Emily's affair. Something about her explanations didn't sit right with me, a nagging sense that there was more to the story than she had revealed. Driven by a need for closure, I decided to dig deeper. My investigation led me to an unexpected discovery. Among Emily's old emails and messages, I found references to a mentor who had played a significant role in her career. The name was unfamiliar, but the context suggested a relationship that went beyond professional. The messages were subtle, filled with coded language and vague references that hinted at a connection Emily had deliberately hidden. With growing unease, I began piecing together the timeline. The mentor's presence overlapped with key moments in Emily's life, including the early stages of her affair with Daniel. It became clear that this person had not only influenced her career, but had also been privy to aspects of her personal life. The implications were staggering. Had Emily confided in this mentor about her affair? Had they encouraged it or even facilitated it in some way? Determined to uncover the truth, I reached out to a mutual acquaintance who had worked with Emily during that time. The information they provided confirmed my suspicions. The mentor, a prominent figure in Emily's industry, had indeed played a significant role in her life. While there was no evidence of a romantic relationship, their influence on her decisions, both professional and personal, was undeniable. Armed with this new information, I confronted Emily once more. Her reaction was a mix of shock and defiance, her initial denial giving way to a reluctant acknowledgement of the mentor's role. She insisted that their relationship had been strictly professional, but her evasive answers and defensive posture told a different story. It became clear that the mentor had been a confidant, someone she had turned to during moments of doubt and crisis. Whether their influence had been positive or toxic was a question that remained unanswered. The revelation added another layer to the complexity of our situation. Emily's choices were no longer just about her and Daniel. They were part of a larger pattern shaped by the people and circumstances around her. While this didn't absolve her of responsibility, it provided a context that made her actions more understandable, if not forgivable. Amidst the revelations and confrontations, I remained acutely aware of the impact on Jack. He was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but he was perceptive enough to sense the tension. I did my best to shield him from the worst of it, focusing on creating a stable and loving environment where he could thrive. Yet, as Daniel's presence in his life grew, so did Jack's questions. He began asking about the nature of their relationship, his curiosity fueled by the subtle shifts in our family dynamic. I struggled to find the right words, torn between the desire to protect him and the need to be honest. In the end, I chose a middle path, framing Daniel as a friend who cared about him without delving into the specifics of their connection. Jack's acceptance of Daniel was both a relief and a source of pain. Seeing them interact, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The bond one had shared with Jack, once so singular and unassailable, was now shared with someone else. Yet, I also recognized that Jack's happiness was what mattered most. If having Daniel in his life brought him joy, then I would find a way to make peace with it. As the months wore on, the situation began to stabilize. Emily and I reached an uneasy truce, our interactions marked by a mix of civility and unresolved tension. Daniel's involvement in Jack's life remained limited but consistent, his role evolving into something resembling that of an extended family member. Through it all, I found myself grappling with the question of forgiveness. Could I forgive Emily for her betrayal? Could I forgive Daniel for his role in appending my life? And, perhaps most importantly, could I forgive myself for the mistakes I had made along the way? The answers remained elusive, but the journey toward finding them had begun. As the threads of my life unraveled and rewove themselves into a new pattern, I began to understand that the resolution I sought might never come in the way I imagined. The betrayal, the lies, and the upheaval had left scars that would never fully fade, but they also revealed truths about myself, about Emily, and about what it meant to move forward. Life, I realized, was not about restoring what was lost but about building something new from what remained. Emily's continued efforts to reconcile were both exhausting and revealing. She approached each conversation with a mix of vulnerability and resolve, acknowledging her mistakes while still expressing hope for our future. At first, I resisted her overtures. The pain was too fresh, the betrayal too raw. But over time, I began to see the sincerity in her actions. She wasn't just seeking forgiveness. She was working to become a better version of herself. Therapy became a cornerstone of her transformation. Emily threw herself into sessions, confronting the insecurities and patterns that had led her down the path of infidelity. She shared her progress with me sparingly, never pushing but always leaving the door open for me to see the changes she was making. It was a slow and difficult process, but it was also genuine. Her journey was not just about repairing our relationship. It was about rediscovering who she was and what she truly valued. While I admired her growth, I remained cautious. Forgiveness, I learned, was not a single act but a series of choices made over time. I couldn't ignore the past, but I also couldn't let it define our future. Slowly, tentatively, I began to let her back into my life, though I knew that rebuilding trust would take much longer. Daniel's involvement in Jack's life had reached a point of stability, but it remained superficial. Despite his initial efforts to establish a connection, his commitment waned over time. He was a man torn between two worlds, unwilling or unable to fully integrate Jack into his life. As much as I resented him, I also pitied him. His detachment spoke volumes about the kind of man he was, one who valued control and convenience over the messy realities of genuine relationships. After several months of sporadic visits, Daniel made the decision to step back entirely. He framed it as an act of selflessness, claiming that he didn't want to disrupt Jack's life or create confusion. But I saw it for what it was, a retreat. He had never been prepared to embrace the responsibilities that came with fatherhood, and rather than face the consequences of his actions, he chose to fade into the background. While his departure brought a sense of relief, it also left a void. Jack, who had begun to warm to Daniel, struggled to understand why he was no longer around. I did my best to explain in terms a child could grasp, framing it as a decision made out of care rather than abandonment. Jack accepted my words with a resilience that astounded me, his trust in me unwavering despite the turbulence around us. The absence of Daniel marked a turning point in my journey. With him gone, I was able to fully focus on my relationship with Jack and the life we were building together. I poured my energy into creating a sense of stability and joy for him, ensuring that he felt loved and supported no matter what. Our bond deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible, his laughter and curiosity a constant reminder of why I had to keep moving forward. Emily's presence in our lives also began to shift. While we were far from the couple we once were, we found a new rhythm as co-parents and, gradually, as friends. She respected my boundaries, never pushing for more than I was willing to give. Her patience and consistency earned back small pieces of trust, though the larger wounds remained. One evening, as we sat together at Jack's school play, I realized how far we had come. The tension that had once defined our interactions had softened, replaced by a quiet understanding. We weren't the same people we had been, but we had found a way to coexist for Jack's sake. It wasn't the fairy tale ending I had once envisioned, but it was real, and it was enough. Just as I thought the chapter was closing, life delivered one final surprise. A letter arrived in the mail, addressed to me in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a brief note from Daniel, accompanied by a legal document. He had named Jack as the primary beneficiary of a trust fund, a gesture that left me reeling. His departure, it seemed, had not been as final as I had thought. The letter explained his decision. He acknowledged his failures as a father and expressed regret for the pain he had caused. The trust fund, he wrote, was his way of ensuring that Jack's future was secure, even if he couldn't be part of it. It was a bittersweet gesture, one that spoke of guilt and responsibility in equal measure. I debated whether to share the news with Emily and Jack. Ultimately, I decided to keep it private for the time being. Jack didn't need to carry the weight of Daniel's choices, and Emily had already moved on from the chapter of her life that included him. The trust fund would be there when Jack was older, a silent testament to a man who had tried, in his own flawed way, to make amends. As I reflected on everything that had transpired, I came to a profound realization. Closure wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you created for yourself. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger, they would always be part of my story, but they didn't have to define it. I could choose to let go, to focus on the love and resilience that had carried me through. Jack became my anchor, the constant that grounded me even in the most turbulent moments. Watching him grow, seeing the world through his eyes, reminded me of what truly mattered. Emily and I continued to navigate our new reality, finding ways to support each other as parents and, eventually, as friends. The pain of the past lingered, but it no longer held me captive. In the end, life didn't give me the neat resolution I had hoped for, but it gave me something better, a chance to rebuild, to grow, and to find strength in the face of adversity. The unexpected twists and turns had shaped me, but they hadn't broken me. I was still standing, still moving forward, and for the first time in a long time I felt free.
How was the video? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you in the next video. Bye bye.